This is the keynote conversation for Silicon Valley Leadership Group's Summit ESG to Carbon Free, presented by Western Digital. This conversation between former Vice President Al Gore and SVLG CEO Ahmad is brought to you by Lyft. Enjoy.
Vice President Gore, we are honored to have you here today for our ESG to Carbon Free Summit here in Silicon Valley. Truly a pleasure to learn from you, for all the executives in the audience, for myself included. So right at the top, a huge thank you for your time today.
Well, Ahmad, thank you. It's an honor to be invited. I have tremendous respect for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I've spoken in some years past to this organization. I'm a big fan of the leadership you all are providing, not only in the Valley, but in our country and internationally as well. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, Mr. Vice President, we appreciate that very much. And maybe on that topic of leadership and being bold and forward thinking, which has been a hallmark of ours at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Your book, Inconvenient Truth, it's been over 15 years, believe it or not, since you wrote it. And if you look at climate and these issues, you've been clairvoyant going back to the mid-'70s when you were a first-term congressman from Tennessee. What have you seen that others haven't? And have the calls that you made, which were bold then, you might say they're conservative now, have your calls been heated around climate and sustainability in your view?
Well, thanks for your kind words. All I did and all I have done is convey what the climate scientists were telling me and what they were telling anyone who would listen. I had the good fortune when I was an undergraduate in college to learn from one of the greatest climate scientists in history, Roger Revelle, and that was unexpected good fortune on my part, but it led me on this pathway that has involved constant communication with the climate scientists who've been very kind and patient and repeating things over and over again in progressively simpler language so that I can understand it, and then that makes it possible for me to communicate it to others. And I wish, of course, as the scientists themselves wish that their predictions had been wrong. But as you say, if anything, they were too conservative, and science is culturally inherently conservative, but in every case, their assessments have been either on the mark or really understated the damage and harm that they warned us about. And since they were spot on, we should pay more attention to what they're telling us now about what will happen if we don't finally listen to their warnings. Some have listened. We have seen some halting progress toward emissions reductions, but others behaved badly, and some of the fossil fuel companies intentionally misled the public. There have been some documentaries put out about this on Frontline with the BBC and CBS News and Time Magazine and others. And Naomi Oreskes and Mark Conway wrote a fabulous book that researched all this. The fossil fuel companies knew. Their in-house scientists told them point blank. And in too many cases, their CEOs and executive teams made a breathtakingly unethical, immoral decision to hide their research. And actually, they began public relations campaigns modeled on what the tobacco companies had done to try to prevent acceptance of the Surgeon General's report about smoking and lung cancer. They did the same thing. And 100 million people died unnecessarily. It's really shocking to look back at the harm that was done. And there's still some of that going on. Greenwashing is a big part of the problem today. But the main part of the problem is we continue to use the sky as an open sewer, and we're filling it with another 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution every day. You can see behind me, this thin blue line is actually a picture from the space station years ago. And it shows how thin the troposphere is. If you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you get to the top of that blue line in about 5 to 7 minutes. And
Wow.
below you would be all the global warming pollution. And that's what we're using as an open sewer. And the accumulated, it stays up there for long periods of time. The CO2, which is the biggest source of the heat trapping pollution, each molecule stays an average of about 100 years. Others stay shorter, others stay longer, but that's a pretty good average. And the accumulated amount now traps as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 first generation atomic bombs exploding on the Earth every 24 hours. And it's kind of hard for me, any of us, I guess, to stretch our minds around how much extra heat that is. It's incredible. And that's essentially the reason why California and the West is in this historic drought right now. It's why 6 of the 7 largest fires in the history of California have been in the last 2 years. It's why Lake Mead and Lake Powell are down below levels they haven't seen since they started filling them. It's why the ocean-based storms are getting stronger and more destructive. It's why we have these clusters of tornadoes wreaking devastation in the heartland. It's why the ice is melting and the sea level is rising, and why in some low-lying island nations and some low-lying delta regions, as in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia and the Nile Delta, agriculture is being ruined by the salinization of the soil with the rising sea level, and people are having to move. The temperatures are, 20 of the 21 hottest years ever measured have been since 2002. We're seeing all-time temperature records broken this late spring and early summer. The official astronomical summer hasn't even started yet, and we're seeing the records continue to fall. Now, the good news is we have the solutions, but this truth is still inconvenient for some. It's still pushed away by some. More and more people are awakening to it, and really the survival of our civilization is at stake.
Well, let me double click on that, the good news element. My sense is that you are a realist, yet an optimist. What are businesses getting right? Apple, Kleiner Perkins, right, where you're on the board, you're a leader, they're longtime members here at Silicon Valley Leadership Group. So many of our CEOs and executives are committed to trying to do the right thing, as opposed to what the horrible examples you shared. What's going well in your estimation?
Well, to give you one example, partly because of the incredible innovation in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, the solar electricity industry and the wind electricity industry have both matured to the point where electricity from both wind and solar is now cheaper than electricity from burning fossil fuels in almost every geography on Earth. That's relatively new that we've crossed that threshold.
Right.
But where new build is concerned, it's good news that if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide in every country last year, 90% of it is renewable, and almost all of that solar and wind. And the International Energy Agency projects that in the balance of this decade and going forward, 95% of all new electricity generation will be solar and wind. On the transportation front, which is in the US the biggest source of global warming pollution, electric vehicles are rapidly becoming cost competitive. Within the next 12 months, the EV models will be cheaper than their combustion counterparts in some very important categories. Within 3 years, they'll be cheaper than their combustion counterparts in every category. We have now the promise of green hydrogen made from the zero marginal cost renewable electricity. That's the flip side of intermittency. When they have more being produced than demand for it, then all of a sudden it becomes economical to crack water part and get the zero emission green hydrogen. It'll take some time to scale that up, but it's coming, I'm confident. Circular supply chains are coming along. The revolution in regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry is extremely important. Ahmad, what we're seeing more broadly is a sustainability revolution that's taking hold across every sector of our economy. It's based in part on new information technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence, even blockchain, but also developments in biology and genetics. We're seeing many executive teams now acquire the ability to manage protons and electrons and atoms and molecules and proteins and genes, and with the same facility that the IT companies have long since demonstrated in managing bits of information. And this sustainability revolution, which features levels of hyper precision that were unimaginable in the past, it now has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And it's every bit as disruptive as the digital revolution. And it's producing winners and losers, but those who are first movers or early movers are way more likely to benefit from what is now being commonly understood as the largest new investing opportunity in the history of the world.
Are there particular areas of innovation technology that most excite you? You got you know satellites for measuring GHG. You've got so much going on around machine learning, as you mentioned, artificial intelligence that's very related to potentially near term having a significant impact on improving our climate.
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of the new developments that are appearing. I'll say, first of all, even though we have these positive developments, you know, the science fiction writer Wilson once said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And that's true with the sustainability revolution. Developing countries, where most of the increased emissions are projected to come from in the years and decades ahead, if you're in Nigeria, you want to build a huge new solar farm, you have to pay interest rates for capital in the private market 7 times higher than the interest rates in the developed OECD countries. The World Bank ought to be leading the way to fix that, but the World Bank's been completely missing in action. President Biden ought to demand the resignation of David Malpass, the head of the World Bank. I've been saying this, and I hope the White House we can summon the votes among all the shareholders. The idea that facing this climate crisis, the international community is not fixing the access to capital in developing countries is literally insane. As the United Nations has said, the World Bank is missing in action. So why doesn't President Biden fix this? I love President Biden. I'm a big supporter, but these things can't be allowed to just linger on. Now, let me give you a specific answer to your question. What am I most excited about? I've been spending a huge amount of my time on this new initiative called Climate Trace, along with others, including a young man named Gavin McCormick at a company called Watt Time. There are a dozen different high-tech companies and universities and NGOs. We've all come together to create Climate Trace. Trace stands for tracking real-time atmospheric carbon emissions. And it's difficult to see CO2 emissions from space because looking down through the column of air that's enriched with CO2, the noise-to-signal ratio is very difficult. You can see methane, but you have to focus on individual locations. We have pulled together a new approach that's based on machine learning and artificial intelligence to collect data continuously from 300 existing satellites in the visible light range and the infrared and other wavelengths. We collect data from 11,100 sensors, ground-based, air-based, sea-based, and multiple data streams available publicly on the internet to generate algorithms, millions of them, and then test them with machine learning. And a large number of companies around the world have agreed to give us their measurements from their own boilers and their own refineries, et cetera, not for us to use, but to use for ground truthing so that the machine learning algorithms can constantly improve. And we will publish in late October of this year the world's first ever asset level inventory covering at least the 500 largest greenhouse gas emitting sources in every subsector of the economy in every country. And the old phrase, you can only manage what you measure, actually makes a lot of sense. And we have not had the ability to understand exactly where the emissions are coming from. We will have that now. And I've been really focused on this. We published the first global inventory last October at the nation state level. First time it's ever been available with every sector of the economy. But getting down to the facility level, individual refineries and power plants and garbage dumps emitting methane, we're going to get it all. And I'm very, very excited about it. And we're developing in concert with this inventory information about all the ownership data, who's responsible for each site. And we're working with NGOs and investors, financial institutions, and governments in order to make the information available to them so they can make it actionable as they wish to.
We'll look forward to that report. And as you say, being able to get the data, being able to measure it, and having actions connected to that will certainly be very important. Another topic connected, carbon offsets. And I asked the question, given our audience of corporate executives, this is something for many of our companies that's a part of their sustainability strategies. I notice it has not been mentioned by you thus far. Where do offsets fall on a net zero path in your estimation?
Well, the world has been on a journey of sorts where offsets are concerned. They will play a role in our path to true net zero, but we've had some misconceptions about how offsets can be a kind of a get out of jail free card. And so many people piled into the offset market that a lot of people were claiming the same offsets. Some of the forests that were claimed as offsets 2 years ago burned up in forest fires last year. There's been double counting. There's a lack of what's called additionality. In other words, would the forests have been protected anyway? Would the wetlands have been protected anyway? In some cases, areas that were already under legal protection were used as offsets. Well, that's not additional. That's not real. And it was tempting early on this journey for a lot of companies to say, "Oh, look at how cheap these offsets are. We can become, net zero." They use the phrase loosely by just buying up all of these very, very cheap offsets. Well, it turns out it doesn't really pan out because we're not solving the crisis that way. But some of the offsets are valid and valuable and should be allowed. So here's where I think we are. The Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, generally acknowledged to be the most accurate source of information about offsets. It is helping companies and other parties who want to get to net zero create and implement sound net zero pledges and action plans. And the Science Based Initiative organization says that offsets can play a role, but a relatively minor role, and they have to be evaluated very, very carefully. They recommend that a company must reduce its emissions by 90 to 95%, and then and only then should they look to validated offsets for the remaining emissions. And ultimately, the key word in the phrase net zero is not net, it's zero. We all have to do all that we can as quickly as we can to get to zero emissions. Let me just say, Ahmad, this is way more serious than most people uh, realize. Uh,
Right.
and the scientists that I'm in constant dialogue with have begun to get increasingly concerned. About 125 scientists last month, not previously activists in any way, decided to leave their labs and go and glue themselves to the doors and gates of these facilities. And they look, we've given you all the research. There are no more serious questions to be resolved here. We're destroying the future of human civilization. We got to stop using the sky as an open sewer. Hello, can we start reducing emissions? So, now, one other point on the offsets. There is an important climate justice dimension to this debate that's often overlooked. I'll give you an example. I've worked with a 97% black community in Memphis, Tennessee, in my home state of Tennessee, who's been fighting against a source of pollution that causes their cancer rate to be 5 times higher than the national average. There have been a number of spills and insults and health problems that are really difficult. So if the source of that pollution, which, as is commonly the case, is way more likely to be adjacent to a low-income community of color than to a wealthy white community, and that's just a fact. But if that polluting facility says, "Oh, look, we bought a forest in Bolivia, so we're good now," the community that's still breathing in the pollution isn't that comforted by the fact that this polluter has bought the rights to offset the pollution on another continent where they can't verify it. They don't know if it's real or not. And even if it is real, it doesn't stop the real damage being done to their lungs and their children and their families from the pollution. So this has many dimensions to it. And short answer, offsets, if they're fully validated within the context of deep emissions reductions, can play a role. They're not a get out of jail free card. They have to be scrutinized very carefully.
Incredible perspective, Mr. Vice President. And on that equity point that you raised, the record is not good for BIPOC communities when it comes to environmental justice, as you elucidated clearly. When we talk about this movement, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about making the climate a better place, how do we do so in an inclusive manner? You've had a great track record on diversity. These aren't new issues to you at all, but they're very big issues to those communities. How can they not be left behind by all of this?
Yeah, it's really important to focus on this. Professor Robert Bullard at Texas Southern University has been the pioneering scholar of climate justice and environmental justice. And he has written a number of extremely important books about this. Other scholars have joined with him. The environmental justice movement really was begun by a black community in Wilson County, North Carolina, on the Virginia border, way back in 1982. Ben Chavis was then the head of the NAACP, and he helped to make this issue. But it was really the people in this small rural community who were awakened one day to the news that poisonous PCB waste was going to be dumped in their community or on the outskirts of their community. And all the dump trucks were coming down the highway. And these people laid their bodies down on the highway and refused to move. And that was that they ultimately won that struggle, but that was the beginning of the climate justice movement, the environmental justice movement. I have partnered with Reverend William Barber II in his Poor People's Campaign. And just to give you a bit of history, you probably know that more than 50 years ago, Dr. King began the first Poor People's Campaign, not long before he was assassinated. 50 years later,
Right.
uh, uh, he has picked this back up, and his co-chair is Reverend Liz Theoharis. The original three evils that Dr. King inveighed against were poverty, racism, and militarism. Uh, they have now added a fourth evil, ecological devastation. And it is a modern realization that the instruments of hatefulness and prejudice and discrimination were not only guns and fists and redlining and legal measures, but also the placement of pollution flows. It is a fact all over the United States, all over the world. If we had been paying more attention to the kinds of health problems that emerged in communities of color that were victimized by these pollution flows, we would have had a head start on realizing the problem facing the entire world. But now they are intricately interwoven. June 18th, I will be in Washington, D.C. With Reverend Barber and Reverend Theoharis and the Poor People's Campaign. And I will be making a speech in D.C. at the Moral March on Washington about ecological devastation.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing around a topic, as you noted, that's multi-layered, but on the other hand, just requires action. And those of us in these positions of influence taking steps in the right direction. And it's a good segue to what I hope will be a positive close here to such an insightful conversation. But talking about sustainable capitalism, I know that's the hallmark of your investment fund. I'd like to ask you what sustainable capitalism means to you, and for our large corporations, for the executives in the audience, how can companies best align via their treasury functions, their ESG investments with the long-term climate goals we're talking about here? Greenwashing, you noted, can be a real issue even around green debt and green bonds that might not be, green. So how do we best achieve that alignment?
Yeah, well, you may have noted if not many days ago, the federal police in Germany showed up at the headquarters of one of the largest banks. The whistleblower had told them about greenwashing, and the CEO resigned, and people may go to jail for it. So it's a big deal, and it's of growing importance. But to take the larger context, as you mentioned, sustainable capitalism seeks to maximize long-term economic value by reforming markets to address real needs while fully integrating ESG metrics throughout the decision-making process. And this applies to the entire investment value chain, from entrepreneurial ventures to large public companies, seed capital providers to institutional investors, employees to CEOs, activists to policymakers. And for companies, thinking about sustainable capitalism has to begin with an assessment of what it is that your business values. Business leaders have to look at how they're measuring progress, both in the short term and in the long term. And the tools and metrics we use to make decisions today implicitly mark some things as significant and others as things that are safe to ignore. Well, unfortunately, that all too often the things that are labeled as safe to ignore include so-called negative externalities, an economist jargon phrase, but pollution and all the global warming pollution is a negative externality. It's not included in many accounting schemes. Also left out are positive externalities, and that is the value of public goods. So, in the accounting systems that are commonly in place, if a community, for example, invests in education or family services or mental health care, that's an expense, mark it down. But the benefits that come rolling back in the years following are not counted as income. So you've got the expense side covered, but the benefits are externalities, positive externalities. So we're seeing, GDP goes up and people cheer, but it's accompanied by a massive increase in global warming pollution. and a continued chronic underinvestment in education and healthcare and pandemic preparedness and environmental protection. We also ignore the distribution of incomes and net worths to the point where 1% of the world's people have 46% of the world's wealth. And we're now at levels of hyper inequality, not only in the wealthy countries, but in the developing countries as well. And these metrics also ignore the depletion of critical natural resources like underground water aquifers, a looming issue not only in California but elsewhere. The strip mining of our precious topsoil, we're losing a great deal of it with the emphasis on heavy plowing. We need to shift to regenerative agriculture. So in any case, businesses ought to begin by pulling back from the narrow focus on short-term profits for one of their stakeholders, the shareholder, and instead seek to identify where their companies intersect with and have an impact on the environment, on human rights, social justice, and more. Their other stakeholders, of course, are their employees and the communities where they're located, and the employees and communities in their supply chains, the environment in which they operate, the ethics and values in the C-suites and how they permeate the entire company. So multi-stakeholder capitalism is connected to sustainable capitalism, and far-sighted business leaders are now really focusing on making this transition. At least that's the experience that I have had watching some of the best and brightest.
In our theory, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, is that those companies actually, with that far-sighted leadership, can be more profitable in the near term.
Absolutely.
Vice President Gore, thank you so much. And for those in the audience, if you're not fired up and inspired after hearing this conversation, you might be in the wrong room. We're truly honored to have you. Thank you for the insights and perspective today.
Thank you, Ahmad, and thank you for the invitation.